Welcome back for another episode of the Chamber Podcast. My name is Rob Johnson. This is a special remote episode. Our guest is waiting on the line right now. We're going to talk politics on this episode. And if you're adverse to politics, if it might be something that you're not a big fan of, fear not. This is not going to divulge into a big, long debate over hot button issues. We are just simply talking basics here. And joining me on the line to do that is John Sellek. He is the chief strategist at Harbor Strategic Public Relations out of Lansing, Michigan. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you and I have had some conversations before. This is certainly not our first interaction, and I really like the idea of this platform that you have, this baldly bipartisan, and I'll let you get into the details of that. But before we jump into the inner workings of that platform, tell me a little bit about yourself, background.
Sure. I went to Michigan State University and I loved politics. I didn't know exactly. I thought I was going to go and be a lawyer. Thank God I didn't do that. A lot of my friends did. But nonetheless, I worked on my first political campaign was on a governor's race that won for John Engler. And I got to work for him during his second two terms. I was very young back then, but I have to always try to note that. But that got my start into electoral politics and governing. So I've worked in the governor's office, the state legislature. I was deputy chief of staff for the House of Representatives for 6 years around policy, nonstop, and politics there. I was a communications director for 2 Michigan attorneys general. And we find this out in the world that AG doesn't really stand for Attorney General. It stands for Aspiring Governor. So we had 2 governor's races there too. Politics and policy mixed all the way along. And I decided, hey, I should do my own PR business. So I've been out on my own at Harbor Strategic since 2019.
How's the business been going?
It's been going great. And it's been a fascinating mix of me being able to use my just straight up public relations skills with business clients and all kinds of, it's surprising how many people either have something good to say or are in trouble. Both can happen on the same day, so there's plenty of work there. We do a lot of work in what we call the public affairs space, so a lot of legislation at the state and federal level. We're trying to educate voters or just people out there to know what's going on an issue, make sure they're speaking up and talking to legislators about what their opinions are. People have like a million different sources of information flying at them, whether they want to or not these days. It's really a tricky world out there. And so we try to help businesses and organizations and associations like chambers. We work a lot with the Michigan Chamber. That's how I got in contact with the Brighton Chamber. It's pretty cool how the Brighton, Howell, and Heartland are all working together. I think that's awesome. And, I moved to Brighton 8 years ago from Lansing, and it's just an awesome place to live. I'm proud to be there. I'm sure maybe if I live there another 10 years, they'll finally say that I actually am from Brighton. I don't think anybody considers that to be the case yet, but it's a pretty great opportunity to come out here and talk about these things and be a part of the event that the Triple Chambers are doing next week.
Absolutely. So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's talk about I'm already going to mess up the name. Let's talk about baldly bipartisan. So walk me through what that is and how it's in association with the chamber missions.
Yeah, sure thing. In the line of work that I'm in, whether I'm working on policy stuff or PR, I get quoted all the time in the newspapers because I worked for Republicans my whole life. So it's like, here's what's going on with politics from the GOP perspective. And I would be in these news stories all the time with another guy named Adrian Hemond here in Lansing. And I knew of him. He was on the other side of the Capitol from me. But, back in those days, if you were on the other side of the Capitol, it meant you were basically in the other party and you didn't talk to those people. So one day I called him up, like, we are in all the same stories all the time, giving the Republican and the Democratic viewpoint, supposedly. Let's get lunch. And it turned out we hit it off. And a few people saw us having lunch and say, why are you guys being friends? And we're like, why shouldn't we? Like, why shouldn't people be talking more often? Because frankly, the more we got outside of politics and the more we worked in the public relations world or in the business world, you saw that partisanship was not the leading factor in what people wanted to talk about, whether they were mad, happy, or indifferent. It's not the way that they guided things. So we started doing these events just sort of by accident together. And it was easy to name it, apparently, because we were bipartisan, but we were both bald. So that became the name with a little alliteration. We were just at an event a couple weeks ago where somebody came up to me and said, I overheard a person in the hallway say, can you believe they called themselves baldly? And I'm like, could you believe we wouldn't call ourselves bald? Like, have you seen us? What are you talking about? So we find that there's essentially almost no end to the requests for us to come and talk about these things, because what I like to say, we joke about it, Rob, is that we are not normal. You're probably not exactly normal. You're aware of what's going on and pay attention to politics, what we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
If you have a Twitter account, you're probably not very normal. And guess what? The vast majority of America does not have a Twitter account, even if Elon Musk's goal is to have that be the case. So they're not sitting inside this bubble like we are in Lansing, per se, or say, talking about politics 24/7. They want a place, I hate to use the word safe space, but they're looking for a place where they can listen and ask questions and hear both parts at one time, because it's basically dangerous to stick your head above water and say anything about politics if you don't know where you're sitting or who you're sitting next to.
Yeah. That's one of the things that's always been interesting to me is I've looked at the political landscape, and I've been in Brighton for about 5 years, and seeing how politics work at the local and state level. And it's interesting, like even when you made the comment of like people saw you two having lunch together and they're like, why would you want to do that? It's like, well, why is that our first thought? Why are we so set on being identified by our politics?
Right.
Now, I don't think it's to the degree where people are like, this is the most divided we've ever been as a country. I'm like, well, read a book. You might find some divisions somewhere in the 1800s that might rival what you're thinking right now.
Right. A few.
But I think a lot of people miss the fact that the only way we're going to accomplish things is if we work together, and people are always going to have a variety of ideas, and some ideas are really bad and some are really good, but we don't know that until we actually talk to the people on the other end.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the problem is, like right now, we do two things happen, one of two things. Social media allows us to self-sort closest to the people that we like or we think align with our values. It seems more comfortable to be in that space, but it also cuts us off from the ability to talk to other people. And we joke that it's the holiday dinners where you're stuck with the uncle who's on the opposite side of you on one issue or the other. And it's really almost the only place now where we're encountering those things. And then the second part is when we do encounter those things, people just start arguing. And if you look, unfortunately, at the comments section on any newspaper, on any Facebook post, I mean, heck, if you even just look at some of the Brighton-focused, private, not even private groups, but Facebook groups, one person takes it the wrong way and then it spirals out of control. And they're like, why would you want to be part of that? So we pride ourselves on trying to come to these events. We meet with like business groups, associations all over the place at their conferences, or just in their hometowns, like we're doing next week in Heartland, to try to have an opportunity to talk about those things. And I find it pretty interesting that the number of people, Rob, that come up to us afterward, they're still a little bit nervous about raising their hand and asking that question in front of the room, but they'll come out and talk your head off. Afterward, they felt like a release to talk about it, or they send you a text afterward and they want to talk more about it. People are hungry to like somehow feel better about what's going on.
Yeah, and it gets to the point where people need a platform to be able to discuss things in a way where they're not. There's a difference between asking a question and making a statement. A lot of times we take people's questions as definitive statements, and that's such a conversational mistake. You can ask questions without being labeled something. And I'm curious, as you guys go into these events and you're talking to people about the political landscape, what are some things that you hope to get out of the event? And conversely, what are some things that you hope the people attending are getting out of the event?
I personally have found it uplifting to go to the events. It's not very often, actually probably never, in the 4 years we've been doing this since 2020, where there's been any kind of argument or fight. We certainly, I don't want to jinx myself, no brawls next week at Heartland, but
I can't wait to see Pam like throwing a chair, like knocking someone through a table. That'd be awesome.
Exactly.
I wouldn't be mad. That'd just be awesome to see.
It's when people are asking questions or they give a knowing laugh. I'll make jokes like I talk about from the Republican side. That's my job on the panel. But I talked about polling data that's out there, and it's enlightening because a lot of people answer that truthfully, surprisingly. And there was a poll out there from CBS News last year. Who do you trust more as a Republican voter? Do you trust your family or Donald Trump? And I say it was Donald Trump won 72 to 67 in that poll. And the room breaks out laughing, but then they also go, oh, yeah, right. Anybody I know that's a Trump supporter, that is what they would say. And so then we have some laughs about it. And then that kind of breaks the ice and we can keep talking through those issues. But basically the way that everybody's trained now to communicate on your phone, on social media, there's not really a polite place to talk about those things, let alone if you ever did want to ask a question and not feel stupid about it, because why should you? There's so much going on. There should be a million questions being asked.
Right. And it's even at a local level, it's difficult to stay up on politics and who's on the ballot, who's the township supervisor going to be, and what does that race mean for, the section that we're in locally. And then you take that and it just keeps multiplying at a state level, federal level. And I think one of the biggest problems I see with people when it comes to politics is they just make broad sweeping assumptions based on something they heard without fact checking. And that's a major problem. Do you guys
That
get
would
into
take
that
that would
very
take
much
work
when you're
though, Rob.
talking?
That would
It
take a
would
lot of
take
work
some
though.
work.
Like you, an opinion or fact. Like I'm talking to my kids about this all the time. My high school age kids, they have a lot of opinions. They think they're facts. Um, and online, if you are hanging out in a group of people that think close to the same way you do, you never have to fact check. You just get to say what you want to say, and that's what makes it so much easier for when these two groups sort of collide somewhere in public to not even understand how to talk to each other at all. And you think I grew up in Lansing, a Democratic county, Union County. Um, I always thought that Livingston County was really conservative, and it is. But it's not as conservative as it used to be as it grows. And a lot of people come from Western Wayne and from Washtenaw, and even like me from Lansing. A lot of things are changing, and probably not to the happiness of everybody there. But I've become an advocate for Howell and Brighton and Harlan. People like think, well, I usually just drive past there. I stop at the Starbucks at a Brighton before I keep going to Detroit or vice versa. And it's like you need to stop in these places and check them out. But before I get too far off track, we currently have a Democratic member of Congress, and Alyssa Slotkin, who has found her way all the way up to 40% of the vote in Livingston County. Now she brands herself in a more moderate way, but nonetheless she's finding a way to get to that vote total. The reproductive rights ballot initiative got 48% in Livingston County. That would like tell you that it's not quite as hardcore red as you might think, that there's some issues that will cause some things to sort of split up. And so we are seeing more of these kind of discussions have to happen even inside Livingston County, even not just out in the rest of the planet.
Exactly. And that's another thing too, as you look at Alyssa and the work that she's done. She does a lot with businesses. She's obviously, in my opinion, labeled herself in that more moderate category.
Yep.
And it's working. How you feel about, Mike Rogers and that race and how that's going to fire off when we get into the primaries. But you have to take note of what people are doing, and you have to be aware of the issues. And you have to have justification for why you're backing something. And that's one thing I always talk to people about when it comes into politics is how do you justify the belief that you have? And a lot of people just have it and they're very passionate about it, but there's not really a lot of context or merit behind that view other than just hot air. And it's what I found is that the deeper you go on an issue, the more rational of a conversation you can have, because now you're not operating from a defensive mechanism. You're operating from a position of knowledge and experience.
Right. More than likely, we probably all need to, meet at Two Frogs or at Label or Champs, have a beer, not too many, let your guard down a little bit and be able to talk about these things. And, hopefully that's what we'll see at the event next week. Whether people are comfortable enough to raise their hands during the event or they want to talk about this stuff for a little while afterward. Like I said, the after conversations are oftentimes the ones that are more eye-opening to people once they're a little bit more comfortable. But I still, like from my position being on stage, I've had plenty of times where I thought, is anybody listening? They're just staring at me, their mouths hanging open. But the laughs or the knowing looks, or when they look at each other after you say something, you're like, okay, they do want to know about this stuff. They do want to talk about it. It's all around us. And in the year like 2024, the national media is controlling the flow of all the information. Even when we get down to the local races that we'll see in Livingston County, House races, the congressional race, those people running those seats have a hard time talking about their own issues that they want to talk about. There's so much money and sound going on the national fights that it just becomes, where do you stand on the national fights? And it becomes hard to talk about those local issues you mentioned earlier.
So talk to me about some of the big races that are going on in 2024. Obviously, we're full into the election cycle. Big race coming up in November. So what seats are you keeping an eye on this year?
For certain, the biggest battle that's statewide probably is for the State House of Representatives. Kind of a confusing mess there, but the Democrats had a 2-seat majority. And despite the fact that we just passed a constitutional amendment in Michigan last year that extended term limits, it almost doubled the amount of time you could sit in your House seat. because that usually was what was causing the churn, is that term limits happened and you were looking for your next place to run and move on to. Correct or not, that's how it worked. We extended this, and then we had Democrats leave. And they're in the majority. Trust me, I've been in the majority and the minority working in the House, and the majority is a far more fun place to be than the minority. You can't pass anything. And two members decided to go back home and run for mayor in Warren and Westland in Wayne County. And they both won. So that left those two Democrat-held seats open, which left the House in Lansing tied 54 votes to 54 votes. And you might think, okay, sounds like a time for bipartisanship, but that's not how the rules are set up. And the Democrats will say, just wait a second here. Those were Democrat seats. We're going to have special elections. Democrats are going to win those seats because of the way those districts are drawn. We're going to go back to like business as usual. But what that does is it's put a huge delay on any kind of action on any legislation in Lansing right now. And the biggest thing will be the budget. They're already starting to work on that. The governor announced that. But the special elections will be sort of not surprises likely. We're going to see two Democrats win those two seats, and we'll go back to a 56-54. It's what happens in the fall in these races that get underway after the filing deadline in April. Right. Donald Trump in these polls winning over Joe Biden by sometimes as many as 8 points. A lot of races that would be close in these state House races could easily move a Republican in a Republican direction, even if the candidate wasn't any good, just because of how many people move away from Biden and move to Trump. So the state House races are going to be a really big deal. Obviously, we're sitting right in the middle of what was the most expensive U.S. congressional race in the entire United States. Alyssa Slotkin versus Tom Barrett. Now with Congressman Slotkin running for Senate. We've got another race. So we have Curtis Ortell, a former state senator from Lansing and part of a longtime political family, and Tom Barrett again running on the GOP side. That seat, once again, is more than likely to be one of the biggest spending seats. And what does that mean? It means you cannot escape it. Your phone has ads on it. Your laptop has ads on it. Your TV has targeted digital media on it. It's everywhere.
The mailbox is full. Yeah.
Right. You get on a podcast and you guys are talking about it. Like, it doesn't go away. So those two things, and then obviously our U.S. Senate race. I think a lot of people thought Senator Debbie Stabenow would have won re-election in a cakewalk probably had she won. And most senators seem to stick around until they're like 100 years old. So Stabenow announcing she would voluntarily leave while she was only 72 years old is like a whole generation earlier than most senators like to depart. So good for her. Yeah. I'd want to retire too. She helped line things up. It looks like for Alyssa Slotkin on the Dem side. We've got several people in the primary on the Republican side, like Mike Rogers. So it's kind of funny. We could end up with a Brighton, like a Livingston County-based U.S. Senate race with Mike Rogers versus Alyssa Slotkin.
What do you think is going to emerge out of that primary on the Republican side?
Well, Mike Rogers got a lot of support out of D.C. right away from the structures that are set up in D.C. to help elect majority. So both sides have them. The GOP side and the senatorial committee right away put out a statement saying Mike Rogers looks like the kind of candidate that could win in a general election. That was the little tip of the hat, like that's our person. We want to get going there. But like, you know, when Donald Trump decides to make an endorsement, a primary, it has a major effect. And an example we can look at is right next door in Ohio. They have a multi-way open Senate seat, and on the GOP side, the person that was in last place got the Trump endorsement in December and moved up to first place, although it's still super competitive. So that got him from last to first, but only by a couple points. Now there's three people clustered together at the top instead of two. So we're going to have to be watching how that turns out. But certainly Mike Rogers had a lot of experience and a lot of networks and raising money and knowing. He's like a classic communicator. He's very good at it. He was great on TV. And Alyssa Slotkin's done the same. So it's going to be a race that's going to be watched across the country. And with the Senate being so close, it's obviously really going to matter in the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, and one other thing you have to look at as well is in 2022, a lot of Trump-backed candidates, at least nationwide, didn't fare as well as people thought that they might in their elections, their general elections. So that'll be interesting to see how 2024 shakes out, certainly. So before we wrap up, anything else you want to tie up on the event next week up in Heartland?
Yeah, we want to see you out there. I think the work that the chambers are doing together, they're keeping their own flavor and their own hometown focus, but they're working together because Livingston County is one of the top 10 counties in the state. It's high in population. It's high in income earning ability. It's a place that should have a lot more influence. And unfortunately, we're sort of treated like flyover country because you're trucking your way from Detroit to Lansing or Grand Rapids or vice versa. Kind of like we usually say about the Midwest overall when people are flying. the coast to the other coast. And the ability to sort of start working together and combining the resources and the communication skills and showing off what the county has is really important. Like I said, I'm a proud member of the Brighton Chamber and to live there. And I think an event like the one they're doing together next week is a really great step forward. So the more people that show up and can be there and talk about it on social media, not only after, but before we go into it, tell people about it, the better off we all are in Livingston County.
Fantastic. Well, I certainly appreciate all the work that you do to keep people educated and keep things balanced as well. Make sure people are hearing both sides and they have all the facts in the right places. So I certainly appreciate that for our listeners. All of the information on that event will be in the show notes. Thanks again for your time.
All right. Thanks for having me very much.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, that's going to wrap up this week's edition of the Chamber Podcast. I appreciate all of you watching. We'll catch you back here next week. Take care.